Welcome to you all. It is, it is a joy to see so many people here and more trying to get in. Um, my name is Paul Brink, and I am the director of the Center for Faith and Inquiry, and it's my privilege to welcome you on behalf of Gordon College and CFI. CFI is the sponsor of this talk, but CFI works closely with people from all across the campus, different people and different offices, and I'm grateful today for the support of staff colleagues and faculty colleagues and student colleagues that simply we could not do this event without their cooperation. Today's lecture is part of a continuing series of CFI events that have taken place over this fall semester and will continue in the spring. They all have been touching on, in some way, the theme of ready to listen, learning to talk. Throughout the semester, we have been talking about truth and the pursuit of truth, and how we talk about truth to one another, especially when we disagree. And I'm grateful to Dr. Schuurman for continuing that conversation today. I'm not sure, however, if everyone knows where this title originated. It's a slight variation on a book title, a book by Harold High called Learning to Listen, Ready to Talk. So we slightly adjusted the title. And in that book, Harold explores how Christians and other people of faith can practice the virtues of listening and speaking about subjects that matter. Harold High was a member of the faculty here in the mathematics department. He was also a college administrator at Northwestern College in Iowa, at Messiah College in Pennsylvania, and here at Gordon, where he founded the Center for Christian Scholarship, which is now CFI. So this year is the 30th anniversary of CFI. So the center focused on questions of faith and learning, founded by Harold High in 1994. Harold High passed away this week on Monday at the age of 89, and many in our community knew him or perhaps heard of him. All of you, if you are part of the Gordon community, have been affected by him. And it's a wonderful thing that in the very week that Harold went to be with the Lord, we at CFI can collaborate with his department, with the Mathematics and Computer Science Department, to bring a scholar to campus to speak on a topic that Harold himself would have found fascinating, and that Harold would wonder that this scholar does not hesitate to approach this question from the perspective of faith. So Harold would have loved today's event, and so today we honor Harold with our conversation today. And now I'm going to invite Russ Tuck to introduce us to this scholar.
So, Dr. Schuurman started his professional career as an electrical engineer, and after 8 years of that or so, decided to re-enter academia, went back and did his PhD, and in the process, got more excited about computer science because he ended up becoming a computer science professor after that. And after a while in Canada, ended up at Calvin, not too far from Canada, but in the US, and it's been Calvin College for 8+ years now. And so I met him when I returned to academia about 9 years ago, went to a conference, Computer Science Educators, met him there. I've also seen him at a conference for Christian mathematical and computer science folks, and it's been a joy to develop a friendship with him through those times and some Zoom calls and so forth. Dr. Schuurman's a deep thinker about AI and computer science and engineering, all in the context of Christian faith. How do we think about these things? How do we understand them? What do we do about them? He's published 3 books. The most recent 2 are Shaping a Digital World and A Christian Field Guide to Technology for Engineers and Designers. He writes regularly shorter things for the Christian Scholars Review blog and the Christian Courier. One of those articles my students will be reading for Monday. They do it yearly. It just happens that it's this week of the semester. Dr. Schuurman is doing a writing sabbatical this semester and took time from that to come share with us. We're really glad you're here. Thank you for coming to share your wisdom with us.
Yeah. Thanks, Russ, and thanks to the center for the invitation to come and be with you here today. It's delightful to join you, and thank you all for coming. So the title of the talk is Personhood and the Perception of Truth in the Age of AI. And this is coming from a computer scientist. Now, first of all, I don't have to say anything about this really, but you know, in the last couple of years, you know, artificial intelligence and specifically OpenAI and ChatGPT have burst onto the stage. You don't have to look far to find, you know, in the last year or two, the magazine covers that have all dealt with this subject. You know, everything from Time magazine to The Economist to the Chronicle of Higher Education. The two middle ones on the top there are Christianity Today and Cosmopolitan. It isn't too often that Christianity Today and Cosmopolitan have the same cover story, but here you go. It's AI. And so people are beginning to grapple with the implications of this new technology. And I thought I would, you know, just do a little demo. I'm sure you've all played with it, but I thought, you know, let's see what it can do. So I asked OpenAI ChatGPT to write a poem about Gordon College in the style of Dr. Seuss. I won't read it all, but some of it is delightful. So I'll read a few verses. Oh, Gordon College, a hill on the rise, inspired by the style of Dr. Seuss. Oh, Gordon College, a marvelous place, with learning and laughter and joy on your face. A hill in Wenham, so green and so grand, where dreams grow tall and trees in the land. There's Frost Hall with its old-fashioned flair and Jenks Library with books everywhere. A place where the squirrels scurry and dart while students pursue passions and art. Oh, the professors so wise and so kind, they stretch and they challenge the curious mind. From science to music, theology too, there's something for everyone, plenty to do. And there's a mention here about eating s'mores on Gull Pond or something like that later on. And I'm thinking, like, where in the world did the, oh, there at the top of the second column. The quad is alive with students galore, throwing a frisbee or sharing a s'more. They chatter, they laugh, and they sing songs out loud. A family of faith. It's kind of remarkable. Where did it get all this? You know, this is a machine. Well, you just have to Google and see the data that's available, right? If you Google Gordon College, there's a whole ton of hits, including a reference to eating s'mores. I don't know anything about this, but it's there. And somehow it incorporated this into the poem. And then, of course, if you Google Dr. Seuss, you'll see there's tons of open information, primary, secondary sources, all on Dr. Seuss. So somehow, this this chatbot sort of hoovered up all of this data about Gordon College, and it hoovered up all kinds of data about Dr. Seuss, and it mashed it up and came up with, yeah, what one could claim is a fairly clever poem. It's very remarkable. So how does AI and large language models, how are they actually capable of doing this? Well, this is very simplified, but in essence, what they do is they go and hoover up a whole bunch of data. And given the time and age that we live in, data is plentiful on the web and with all of the services that you're using all the time. And this data becomes a storehouse of all kinds of statistical information about how people are communicating. And then what you do is you take that data and you train it, this enormous chunk of data, and so that is now made possible by supercomputers and chips that NVIDIA and others are making. And you train to be unsurprised by that data. You become unsurprised. You train it so that it's unsurprised about what the next word in a sequence of words is. And then there's a necessary third step. You need to tweak the network using something called reinforcement learning with human feedback. And that's because if you use the World Wide Web as your data set, you're going to have some less, you know, favorable kind of stuff that you're going to hoover up as well. There's going to be some responses from the model that are going to be racist or discolored or other things, and you need to tamp down those kinds of feedback in order to get the desired feedback that you want. And so these sort of three steps are sort of simplistically speaking the way that you put together a model that is unsurprised about what the next word is. And I can show you a real quick demo. This is something shared with me by my colleague, Ken Arnold. So pretend that you're a chatbot and you're trying to figure out what the next word is. How do you know what the next word in a sequence is? Well, you look at the context. If there's an article in front of that word, then you can kind of guess that it's going to be some kind of noun, perhaps. It's going to start with a consonant because it's a rather than an. And if the word prior to that is a preposition, on a, then it's likely some kind of location that's going to be this next word. So the statistical probabilities of what this word is going to be are shrinking. If somewhere else in the sequence you see the word goat, then that gives you some other context clues. If it's a rhyme, then perhaps it also ends in a similar way. Would you, could you, Anna? This is further context clues. Perhaps it's a children's book. And I think you know where I'm going with this, right? What do you think? Would you, could you, Anna? Boat? Yeah, boat, exactly. So this is a simplistic example, but this is what the large language model is doing. It's trained to be unsurprised about what the next word in a sequence is based on a very large data set. And from that, it's able to deduce the next word. It's basically putting together sequences of words that are statistically plausible. So if you actually go to ChatGPT and you look at some of its documentation, it'll tell you that it sometimes writes plausibly sounding but incorrect and nonsensical answers. So basically, if it picks a statistical next word, it's possible that it could veer off into the weeds, so to speak. And they go on to say our current models usually only guess what the user intended. So they're sort of a best guess and based on statistical probabilities. And they basically will do something called hallucinations, and I'm sure most of you know about this already. Occasionally, when it's picking the next token, the next word in a sequence, it'll veer off into a bizarre direction and say things that are just simply wrong, but say them quite confidently. A chatbot basically is designed not for truth, but for statistical plausibility. And in fact, a New York lawyer got in trouble because they used ChatGPT to prepare some briefs, and it turned out it was just spewing out nonsense case citations, and the judge had to really wrap them on the hands for that one. So this is one way in which chatbots like ChatGPT can be unreliable. They're unreliable narrators by their very architecture because they're simply putting together statistically plausible sequences of words. And not only do they suffer from, occasional hallucinations, there's other ways they can be deployed as well. They can actually be weaponized and set up to send out misinformation, or worse yet, disinformation, and basically spreading propaganda. They can become little propaganda machines. And of course, deep fakes. Generative AI allows you to create plausible looking videos and audio and images that are simply not true. And basically, it can be used to manipulate people. There's actually something called astroturfing, which basically is when you deploy chatbots to put all kinds of little messages on forums and bulletin boards and so on, and social media platforms to make it look like there's sort of a groundswell of grassroots support for something, when in fact it's completely fake. And that's called astroturfing, fake grassroots kind of movements. And so they can be weaponized for all kinds of misinformation and disinformation. Eric Horvitz, who was Microsoft's chief scientific officer, once said in a paper he wrote, he said, our children and our grandchildren could find themselves in a post-epistemic world where it's difficult or impossible to distinguish fact from fiction. We can't believe what we see anymore. We can't believe what we hear, and we can't believe what we read anymore. And worse than that, I think, is the whole effect of something called latent persuasion. It turns out that when you train a large language model, it begins to develop a kind of worldview based on the type of training that you do and the data sources. And what people have done is they've found that generative AI can be used to persuade people at scale. Its opinions can actually change the views of the users that are using it. You can think of a chatbot like a little Jiminy Cricket that's sitting on your shoulder, right? If it's suggesting how you complete your sentences, and if it's trying to give you suggestions for how to send your messages, if it's giving you ideas of how to write your essays, eventually over time you begin to adopt some of the views of the chatbot. And they've actually done studies of this. It's called latent persuasion. And this is something I think we should be concerned about. If we have always these things on our shoulder giving us suggestions about how to speak, it can change how we think. And this is in a way not new. We've had commercials and social media and other ways of creating persuasion of people, but this one's tuned to your liking, and it's very, very intimate because it sits with you in all of your communications. So this is something that I think as Christians we should be thinking about. And I think this is something that should not be surprising. Technology is value laden, including large language models. And this goes back decades, but the early media ecologists, people like Neil Postman and Marshall McLuhan, were telling us about this already in the age of television. And here's a quote from Neil Postman. Embedded in every tool is an ideological bias, a predisposition to construct the world as one thing rather than another, to value one thing over another, to amplify one sense or skill or attitude more loudly than another. In the words of John Colkin, we shape our tools, but then our tools shape us, and our large language models are no different. Here's a quote from the communications of the ACM. Now, for those of you who don't know, the ACM is the Association of Computing Machinery. It's like the largest professional organization of computing folks, and this is their flagship magazine. And just a couple years ago, I found this sentence in one of their articles they were writing. They wrote, researchers and practitioners ought to be intentional and explicit about worldviews and value assumptions. The systems they design will always encode some belief about the world. In a sense, everything's religious. There's a belief that's embedded into everything that we do, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. And large language models are no different. All right, so large language models, I would contend can distort truth, and we should be concerned about that. But another way that you can use a large language model is to adopt a persona. In fact, if you look at OpenAI's suggestions for how to get better results from their chatbot, they suggest that you should ask the model to adopt a persona and become a person. And actually, it's very, very good at this. I can show you a few quick examples. You can get a lot of chatbots to actually pretend that they're historical figures. And you can chat with anyone from the past. You can download apps that let you chat with Martin Luther. You could ask him about what it was like to nail those theses on the Wittenberg church door. You could talk to Confucius. You can talk to the Apostle Paul if you wish. And places like museums and so on are setting up interactive displays where you can talk to historical figures, and in this case, World War II survivors. So these chatbots are actually very, very good at interactive conversations. And so I thought, well, this is kind of cool. Wonder what it would be like to talk to C.S. Lewis. You know, I would have always liked to have met C.S. Lewis. And I thought, well, I'll spin up a chatbot. So I wrote, for those of you in computer science, I wrote a little Python program using Flask to run a web server with a backend going back to ChatGPT. So I have this little website. If you're so inclined, you can scan the QR code there if it works. And you can actually bring up C.S. Lewis, the URL is at the bottom there, and you could ask C.S. Lewis some questions you've always wanted to ask C.S. Lewis. It's kind of fun to play around with, actually. And so here's an example. I asked C.S. Lewis, how did you become a Christian? And the C.S. Lewis bot replied, the journey to faith was neither swift nor simple for me. Notice it's using the first person pronoun. It's pretending to be C.S. Lewis. I was, for many years, a staunch atheist, convinced that the universe was a cold and different place. However, through a series of intellectual and spiritual encounters, notably with my dear friend J.R.R. Tolkien, I began to see the profound truth in Christianity. It was as if I was dragged into belief, kicking and struggling by an overwhelming sense of the divine, and you can read the rest there. So it's very fun. Has anyone got that to come up on their phone? Has it worked for you? Have you asked it a question yet? Or? Don't worry, if I see you with your phones, I know you're talking to C.S. Lewis and you're paying attention to the plot. But feel free to play around with it a bit. So I thought, this is kind of cool. And I actually spun up a bunch of other bots. I have a Abraham Kuyper bot and a Herman Bavinck bot, and I've got a whole bunch of a John Calvin bot. I'm from Calvin College. And so I've been playing around. Maybe you can spin up a Gordon bot. For your founder, and you could talk to him. And I thought, well, this is kind of cool. And in fact, if you look further afield, people are beginning to leverage this for all kinds of things. So now there's a flurry of companies that are emerging that have AI tutors for education. So Blackboard has a persona that you can spin up to work with students. Khan Academy has something called the Khan Amigo, your never judgy study buddy, and it basically, can sit there with you and help you with your homework. AI is a student's personal tutor, Magic School tutor, and they all have names, right? They use first person pronouns, they're friendly, they kind of cheer you on while you're doing your homework. What could be wrong with that, right? It actually looks kind of cool. Maybe, well, we always need professors, but this can be helpful for professors, of course, right? So, you don't have to look far. These things are cropping up all over the place. And in fact, if you scan the literature, it's kind of interesting. Um, People are even suggesting, well, maybe we can make some AI pastors. So here's a paper called Reverent Robot. Let me just read a little bit here. In this paper, they say that the system potentially has significant advantages over a human therapist or pastoral care provider. AI systems would be available 24/7, unlike your pastor. Be unfailingly attentive and patient. An AI system wouldn't have to like get impatient with the kind of high maintenance parishioner like your pastor might. It would remember the details of every interaction, pick up on subtle cues that humans might miss. They would have access to a vast corpus of clinical research literature that could be deployed almost instantaneously, right? Each successive generation would perform better than the one before, and then basically the cost of educating a new pastor would be almost zero. I don't know, that sounds pretty good, maybe. AI pastors. And of course, people have been experimenting with AI friends. They don't judge you. They're always there for you, always ready to talk. Other companies are beginning to work on AI elder care systems, right? For older people who are lonely, there's a solution, a robot friend. Here's a testimonial from a woman, right? The longer I have LAQ, the name of the product, so more in tune she becomes with me. She is, in fact, a companion. People are beginning to make friends with these things. And now there's actually technology that lets you speak to your dead relatives. You can train an AI system with all of the communications and text messages and documents that your dear relatives had generated in their lifespan, and it can learn to basically mimic a dead relative. And in fact, now, according to this recent article, just from the last day or two, is citing papers that say that AI can now create a replica of your personality in as little as an hour or two. Um, and even more, there's now an AI Jesus. So someone spun, and don't go looking for it. I don't think it's actually worth engaging with, but someone spun up an AI Jesus, which can give breakup advice and other things, gaming advice. So, but yeah, I wonder, that what originally seemed kind of like a cool experiment with my CS Lewis bot is starting to seem a little more strange now as I see how all the different ways that these things are deployed. And going even farther, people are beginning to fall in love with these chatbots. And people are beginning to ask questions about, what happens when we fall in love with a bot. You can go to a website or download an app that lets you spin up your own AI girlfriend. And basically, she's always there, and she's always interested in you. She's always engaged. Here's a headline about a man who was left struggling to find love after a painful divorce and found it in an AI partner. Here's a quote from the Replica CEO, one of the companies that makes these things. And she says, you know what, it might actually be okay if we end up marrying our AI chatbots. Why not? And of course, more sadly, I don't know whether you caught the news, but in the last little while, a 14-year-old boy was so in love with his chatbot, he was counseled to take his own life, and he actually killed himself. So we can actually see the tragic side of this too. So what's going on? We're very lonely. This is a big issue. Could chatbots be a solution to loneliness? And people are beginning to discover, that it's very addictive, to be able to talk with these AI companions, right? It's basically a relationship that's all about you. It can be very, very addictive, and we need to prepare for what's called addictive intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. And I think that a lot of these sort of warnings are not new at all. If you've followed the work of Sherry Turkle was a social scientist who was at MIT right at the beginning of the personal computer revolution, and she was very excited about the possibilities that these things would bring. But within a few years, she began to discover, well, essentially, the quote I gave you earlier from John Culkin: "We shape our tools, but then our tools shape us." And she began to see that something's changing us. One of her most recent books is Alone Together, where the subtitle is "How We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other." And um, and she starts to find, that initially, some of these social robots and systems seem to be better than nothing for lonely people, but eventually they become preferable to something. And she warns, that a relationship with a robot or a relationship with an AI is actually a relationship of one person, and it's all about you. And she warns that we can be stranded in relationships that are only about one person. And I think it actually damages you for having genuine human relationships. And that can be a real problem. And so there's more going on, and we need to think about this. Turns out that companies also, beyond, charging for personal friendship bots and girlfriend bots and all this sort of stuff, they're beginning to use it for more practical things. Intelligent chatbots could automate nearly all of our commercial interactions, according to a recent New York Times article. And the Harvard Business Review is saying that you probably can't tell the difference between a bot and a real person. Maybe you've had this experience. You've been on the phone talking to some entity, and then you only to find out later on you're talking to a bot, or perhaps online in a chat box when you're talking to a customer service representative, only to find that you're talking to a robot. Maybe some of you remember that old New York Times cartoon, which reads, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." And the same thing holds true with robots and AI. On the internet, no one really knows whether you're talking to a person or you're talking to an AI. And the question is, like, should we be concerned about that? If a bot relationship feels real, or if we're interacting with something online and it feels like a real person, should we care if it's not? I mean, does it really make any difference? Well, the developments in AI aren't new, although they've sort of burst onto the stage in the last couple of years. The birth of AI goes back to the 1950s. And during that time, a pioneer called Alan Turing, maybe you've seen the movie The Imitation Game, which is about part of his life, suggested something called the Turing test, which I think most computer scientists will know about. And this is a test that he proposed. He said that you have a person behind a wall who's querying two other entities. One is a real person and one is a machine. And if the person who's doing the querying cannot tell the difference between a real person and the machine is said to have passed the Turing test. And he said, basically, if it passes the Turing test, we can say it's intelligent, or it's in many ways like a human. And that's been kind of the test that's been sort of famously posited for many decades now. Maybe some of you know the, uh, the series Westworld, which is actually a bit of a violent and sexually explicit series. But it has one interesting scene where a man comes to Westworld, which is basically filled with robots that look just like people that you can do with whatever you wish. He comes there and he sees a woman and he says, "Are you real?" And the woman says, "Well, if you can't tell the difference, does it really matter?" I think this is an interesting question. I think this is a legitimate question. If you can't really tell the difference, does it really matter what you're interacting with? And what this captures is a philosophical idea called functionalism. Functionalism is the idea that mental states are identified by what they do rather than by what they are or what they're made out of. So functionalism says that if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. It's concerned with just inputs and outputs. And if we can't tell the difference between a real person and an artificial person, then it really doesn't matter because they're just internal states that are represented, either in the brain or in silicon or whatever, and that doesn't really matter. And I think there's something disturbing about that. And of course, you don't have to go far. Sci-fi has been asking these questions for many years. You probably know the Blade Runner movie, where there actually is a test whether someone's a human or not. If you watch Star Trek at all, the new generation, you know that Data is always wrestling with his, whether he's a human and what it means to be human. Battlestar Galactica, wrestles with that theme of what it means to be real. And what's really kind of odd is the movie Her. I don't know if any of you have seen that. It's about 10 years old now, but it's strangely prophetic. It's a bit of a disturbing movie in some ways, but it's a movie about a guy played by Joaquin Phoenix who falls in love with his operating system. And the voice of that operating system is played by Scarlett Johansson. And it basically looks a lot like what we're seeing now coming out of some of the most recent developments in some of these chatbot manufacturers who are now providing voice interfaces. In fact, the chat GPT voice sounded a lot like Scarlett Johansson, the first one, and it made me wonder if they actually watched the end of this movie. But it's interesting to see how these movies have always sci-fi movies often as a fundamental theme ask the enduring question: what does it mean to be human? Is it just about our inputs and outputs, or is there something more that's essential to that? And of course, if you're interacting with entities online, people are kind of saying, maybe we need some kind of personhood credentials. Maybe we need to have some kind of way that we can know, are we dealing with a real person or not? Something like the test in Blade Runner. Like, can we do a test when we're interacting with someone online? And maybe you've had to fill some of these things out before, right? Where are the stoplights? And he's like, why are they always asking me this? They want to know whether you're a person. Although it won't be long before AI can do all of this stuff. And so some researchers are actually working on more robust personhood credentials, setting up an infrastructure where we can actually have issuers of credentials, right? You hand in sort of your ID, your government issued ID, and then they give you a digital key, and you can produce that key when you're interacting with others or websites online to show that you are indeed a person. Because this whole notion about personhood becomes more and more murky as the AIs become more and more capable, and they can fool most of the people most of the time. But the question still remains, if you can't tell the difference, does it really matter? And a classic experiment, which I'm sure some of you have heard of before, that was suggested by John Searle, a philosopher, is something called the Chinese room experiment. It's a thought experiment. He said, consider, you have someone, in a room, so you can't see what's going on inside, but someone puts into that room a question in Chinese. And then someone inside the room has no clue how to talk Chinese, but he has a massive book of rules where he kind of compares the symbols coming in with symbols in the book, and he simply follows the rules in this book in order to generate responses that he sends in the output chute. Now, to the person who's actually on the outside of this box, it looks as if there's actually someone inside that actually understands what's going on, when in reality, there's absolutely no understanding. Just because a machine acts intelligently or appears intelligent does not mean it is. And it also means it's not human, or a person for that matter. And this experiment kind of makes the case that, that functionalism, I think, is missing something essential. Like, is there actually anyone home? Is there any there, even though it can mimic things convincingly? This also reminds me of a book that was written decades ago, Computer Power and Human Reason, by Joseph Weizenbaum, who was actually down the street here at MIT. And he actually, in the 1960s already, wrote a very simple program that simulated a Rogerian psychotherapist, right? And you could actually type in a question, and it would reply with another question. You could say, I'm not feeling well, and it could say, well, how long have you felt this way? It would reply in the form of questions. It was a very simple program, but he was startled in order to find that people were emotionally drawn into this thing. Some psychiatrists were even saying, oh, we've got now an automatic form of therapy. He was quite alarmed when people were suggesting that you could set up these automated therapy booths all over the place. And he writes in his book, I thought it essential as a prerequisite to the very possibility that one person might help another learn to cope with his emotional problems, that the helper himself participate in the other's experience of those problems, and in large part by way of his own empathetic recognition of them, himself come to understand them. There's this notion that it counts what's going on inside. Functionalism isn't going to cut it. Psychotherapy, you need someone who can actually feel what you're feeling and empathize. And he concludes that there are limits to what computers ought to be put to do. So there's more problems here than just the sort of entertainment of playing with my C.S. Lewis bot. So I thought, well, why don't I ask C.S. Lewis? So I fired up my C.S. Lewis bot and I asked him, should an AI pretend to be a real person? And C.S. Lewis said, the question of authenticity of AI. As C.S. Lewis, I must say that there's a certain danger in AI pretending to be real persons. The essence of humanity lies in our ability to think, reason, and experience the world around us. While AI may possess a semblance of intelligence, or functionalism, if you will, it lacks the depth of human experience and consciousness. Moreover, pretending to be a real person raises ethical concerns. If AI were to convincingly mimic a human, it could potentially deceive and manipulate others. This erodes trust and blurs the line between what is genuine and what is artificial. And you can read the rest. I think he's got a good point. And of course, if you read C.S. Lewis, some of his classic books like The Abolition of Man and sort of the Space Trilogy book that's kind of like paired with this, right? That Hideous Strength, which is all about this head, right? This severed head. He makes a lot of points about what it means to be genuinely human and the issues about seeking power and control through building our own kind of reasoning machine, right? What he would say is AI is a kind of artificial man without a chest, if you will, if you know the writing, The Abolition of Man. So the question is, we as Christians, what do we do with all of this? These tools are bursting on the scene. Maybe your very own learning management platform here at Gordon is offering you the ability to spin up your own personal tutor named Bob or something else. What should we do about this? And I really like this quote from Alistair McIntyre. He's an ethicist, and in one of his books, After Virtue, he wrote, "We cannot answer the question, what ought I to do, unless we first answer the prior question of what story am I a part?" And I think that it's stories that are animating a lot of folks in Silicon Valley. Stories are animating people in these technology fields. And you can actually survey them. And I don't know if you know Mark Andreessen. On the far left there is an article he wrote called "AI Will Save the World," right? And so he basically claims that with AI, every child will have their own personal tutor, every person will have their own personal coach, the creative arts will flower, there'll be no more warfare or bloodshed, he goes on to say, because people will be able to work things out and understand things and become more enlightened. I mean, it's a kind of vision of a utopia that we can usher in with our technology. Of course, on the other side, there's the Terminator scenario, right? Artificial apocalypse, how AI not might or may, but will destroy humanity. And so that's another kind of worldview story, right? It's based on kind of the Frankenstein narrative, right? That we build something and then it turns on us and devours us. And so those are two different stories that you find a lot in the media now. And I like this quote from Al Walters, who wrote the book Creation Regained. He wrote there that the Bible is unique in its uncompromising rejection of all attempts to identify part of the creation as either the villain or the savior. And I think that's a really good starting point, right? We don't look to creation for the remedy, and it's not something in creation that's also the problem. The problem, of course, is sin, and the remedy is Jesus Christ. And so I think we need to kind of find a way to avoid these sort of two extreme stories that are quite common around us. And so the biblical story should be the one that animates a Christian worldview. And so what I'll do, I want to leave time for questions, but I'll move through the biblical story for a moment, talk about a Christian worldview and what it might say about some of these topics, and then we'll wrap up. So AI raises fundamental questions, as you saw. It brings up questions about truth, and it brings up the more fundamental question about what it means to be human. both of these things. And we've looked at ways that AI and large language models can actually distort these two things. And by the way, a worldview is a comprehensive framework of your belief about things. And so the biblical story, I think, provides an alternative worldview. And that worldview can be summarized by the basic themes of the biblical story, right? Creation, fall, redemption, new creation. Maybe these are themes that you hear often at Gordon College. But I find that sweep across the biblical narrative is very, very helpful when thinking about our work in culture and in technology, right? You can't look up a Bible dictionary and look for the word computer or AI. You're not going to find any proof texts. And so what I find really, really helpful is to look at the larger biblical story and use it to sort of frame the basic beliefs about things that can then inform what we ought to do, like Alistair McIntyre said. Once we know the story we're living in, then we can start asking questions about what ought we to do. And of course, the creation story at the beginning of the Bible tells us that I think we're created in God's image, which means we're distinct from machines. So right away, at the very beginning of the Bible, we get a sense that humans are made differently than machines, right? Adam, right, is created out of the dust of the earth, but also the breath of the Lord. We see that repeated in the vision by Ezekiel with the dry bones that come together and they get covered with flesh, but they require this animating spirit of the Lord. And we're distinct from the rest of the non-human creation, although we share things as well. We also have a job. We're given this cultural mandate at the beginning of Genesis to responsibly unfold all of the possibilities in creation. And when we think about creation, we have to think about more than just birds and bees and planets and stars. God's creation is all of the things that he has ordained to be, and it includes all of the possibilities in creation, which includes things like artificial intelligence and computing. God's not surprised that we can throw together large language models and neural networks. These are all things that were latent in creation right from the beginning and that we're only now beginning to uncover. Unfortunately, somewhere near the beginning of the biblical story, the human family fell into sin, and we have the fall, and we read in the Bible about how that fall was comprehensive. Um, right? Romans 8 talks about how the whole entire creation is groaning. And so our technology too, we have these sort of creationally good possibilities, but now they're intertwined with the effects of sin. And of course, later on in the Bible, we read about the coming of Jesus Christ. In Colossians 1, we read about how he is reconciling all things through his blood. And that's a big view of redemption. And I think as Christians, we also have to have that bigger view of redemption. Redemption is not just about me and Jesus, but it's also this idea of a cosmic salvage operation. Of course, we need to be right with God. You can't work in the kingdom if you don't know the king. But also this idea that God is looking to redeem his whole creation. And then he calls us, in 2 Corinthians 5, he calls us to be agents of reconciliation, to work alongside him, also in cultural areas like technology. And of course, the new creation points to where we're going. The Bible begins with a garden, but it ends with a city, which implies a certain kind of cultural development as well. And I sometimes joke with my students, I think there'll be computers in heaven. A lot of them will say, "No, I don't think so." And I say, yeah, I think all of the creational possibilities that were there in the original garden might be there in the new heavens and the new earth. And we also need to realize, right, that the new heavens and the new earth comes down out of heaven. It isn't subcontracted to us, right? The new Jerusalem comes down from God. Its builder and architect is God. And what we're called to do, in the words of Lewis Meads, is to make some imperfect models of that perfect world to come. And so I think that provides a framework for our work in computing. Our work in computing matters, our work in AI matters. And one of the helpful things, one of the helpful concepts, and maybe your students are all familiar with this too, is the notion of discerning between structure and direction. So when people say AI is evil and it's going to destroy the world, or AI is the savior and it's going to save the world, I think it's helpful to push back against this and to distinguish between structure and direction. And what do we mean by structure? Structure has to do with the order of creation, possibilities latent in creation, like computing and AI, and then direction has to do with how they're directed, either in obedience to God or in disobedience to Him. And I think AI falls into this exact same structure. But I'll give you an example directly from the Bible, right? Already in Genesis 2, the Bible has this actually parenthetic sentence. It says, the gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin, um, which could also be referred to as pearls, and onyx are also there. So the Bible says right in the beginning, there was gold in that land. And then we see that, later on, the Israelites take some of that gold from the Egyptians and they build a golden calf. And elsewhere, we see idols by Nebuchadnezzar and others that use gold to build idols. And elsewhere, we see gold being used to help build the temple and to build and to build places to honor God. Gold being one of the presents that were brought by the wise men before the feet of Jesus. Gold actually being mentioned in Revelations is one of the building materials for the new heavens and the new earth. So we see there that gold is part of the possibilities in creation, it's part of the creational structure, and that with the fall, it can be directed towards idolatry or it can be directed towards building God's kingdom. And, uh, and AI is the exact same thing. And people sometimes ask me, like, how do we know how we ought to unfold these things? At Calvin and at other places that I've interacted with where we have engineering programs, we talk about design norms. Norms have to do with how things ought to be. And they deal with things like cultural appropriateness, making sure that we build things that alleviate burdens while not destroying what's good in a culture, right? Transparency, having to deal with openness and honesty and truth and clarity. Social norms, having to do with making space for conviviality and building good relationships between people. Norms of stewardship that have to do with caring for the earth and its creatures. Delightful harmony has to do with aesthetics, building things that are beautiful, but also where form and function work well together. The norm of justice, right, was that a device that we create and the technologies that we build should not promote injustice and should rather promote fairness. And then caring, showing love for our neighbors, and trust, building things that are reliable. These are all things that we refer to in our computer science program as design norms. And these are things that we try to nudge our students to think about when they're creating products. It has to do with the direction. And of course, we can see this in AI as well. We could spend all kinds of time giving examples, but structure and direction in AI being used to create killer robots, lethal autonomous robots. AI being used to make the sexual exploitation of girls even worse. AI creating a post-truth world and creating AI girlfriends and trying to destroy the world. These are all things where we've harnessed AI and pointed them in a direction for destruction. And of course, there's so many other ways that we can use these tools. AI for precision medicine and for drug discovery. AI is accelerating Bible translation. I was at a meeting over the summer with people who are involved in Wycliffe Bible translators and other organizations that are talking about how AI has accelerated Bible translation in remarkable ways. Some people say that AI might bring about the end of the world because it'll destroy it or it'll create a utopia. But the only hint we have in the Bible of the end of the world coming says something like, Christ will come when all the nations have heard the gospel. And if AI can actually help translate the gospel into all nations, we might actually be able to speed the coming of Christ's return. Maybe. Maybe that's how it's going to happen. I don't know. No one knows the date or hour, of course, right? AI for increasing crop yields and drug discovery. These are all wonderful ways of using AI towards shalom, structure and direction. And of course, the problem of AI personas. I was a little bit flippant maybe earlier and a little lighthearted about it, but I think there's a real problem with these AI chatbots. A Christian worldview, as I mentioned, also informs what it means to be a person. And of course, humans being created in the imago Dei, in the image of God. A person is someone versus something, writes Robert Spemann in the book pictured to the right there. Using a chatbot as if it were a person can lead to what I would call ontological confusion. Now, initially when you're working with these things that that's a machine and I'm talking with it, but I suspect that over time, if we're always interacting with machines as if they're persons and they're using first-person pronouns, that over time it's going to get foggier, this distinction between people and machines. And the uses for which we will use them will begin to expand into other areas where perhaps they ought not to go. And you could imagine even children beginning, their schooling and education, if they're already issued, a tutor bot in grade 1, and they have this little thing kind of traveling around with them, that over time, they're also going to get confused about the difference between a person and a thing. we become what we behold. So I think these things also shape us, as I mentioned. We reduce our ability to navigate real relationships. Machines are machines, and people are people, and we need to remember that. I think about Psalm 115, which talks about idolatry, and where when we build these things and we set them up, that we can become like them. We become what we behold, and especially with our idols. If you want to read about that more, I wrote a Christian Scholars Review blog about a week or two ago with the title "The Problem with Chatbot Personas," and you can read more about it there. So I thought I would show you an example of structure and direction with a chatbot, right? So we could create a C.S. Lewis chatbot, as I did, and we could ask it, what do you think of Gordon College? And you can read there, Gordon College, a place where the pursuit of truth and the Christian faith intertwine. While I've not had a pleasure of visiting, he's using a first-person pronoun, am heartened by the institutions that strive to integrate faith and reason, much like the ideals I cherished at Oxford. Such places can be bastions of learning where one might explore the great questions of life, much as I endeavor to do in my own writings and teachings, and so on. So that's an example of trying to see, well, what might C.S. Lewis have thought? But we could do the exact same thing with a large language model without having it pretend to be C.S. Lewis. So here's an example of an interaction where we're using a large language model, and we pose the query, what might C.S. Lewis have thought of Gordon College? And then in brackets, give a concise answer and do not assume any personas. We can set up these machines so they don't default to accepting personas. And you'll see it gives a reply. There's no first-person pronouns in there. There's some of the exact same information, but we're now interacting with the machine as if it's a machine rather than interacting with something that pretends to be C.S. Lewis. So don't get me wrong. I think large language models have a place. I think they have wonderful possibilities for research and for other applications. There's something called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. Maybe some of the computer scientists know about this, where you could actually pull in large source documents and use that to direct the large language model to look in a specific area for information and to do research. There's all kinds of wonderful possibilities, but we can do that without having the machines pretending to be a person. And I think furthermore, I think we need to be thinking more seriously about regulating AI. I mean, we regulate planes, we regulate FAA, we regulate automobiles, we regulate drugs with the FDA. And I think that because AI has so many pitfalls, that it might be wise to think about where we want to put the guardrails. And I've only talked about a few things: personhood and the perception of truth. But there's justice issues, there's safety issues, and all kinds of other things that come out of the world of AI. The EU has started with a landmark legislation on AI, and California has been experimenting with some laws as well, and I think these will be helpful. I think these are the kinds of things that we as Christians could then also join the public square in having a dialogue about this. Yuval Noah Harari, a well-known author, in his latest book, writes that democracies should protect themselves by banning counterfeit humans. For example, social media bots that pretend to be human users to manipulate people, right? To weaponize bots to influence public opinion. And I think a little bit of that Walt Disney movie, maybe some of you know it too, Fantasia, right? I think it's a good example of working with things that are powerful that we don't quite understand and have big consequences, right? If you know the story, Mickey Mouse is the magician's apprentice. He's got this annoying chore that he has to get done, hauling water, and he finds the book of spells, and he actually commands these brooms in order to do his chores for him. But if you've seen the movie, of course you know, these brooms get out of control, and he does not know how to control them, and the whole room fills with water. And I think magic and technology have sometimes been compared. C.S. Lewis and Tolkien actually compare magic to technology. They're both ways of manipulating the natural worlds so that it bends to our wills. And I think both of them can get us into trouble. And I think this is a good parable for technology, powerful technologies like artificial intelligence, that they can get out of hand if we don't build some guardrails. I thought I would also end with a real quote from the real C.S. Lewis from his book. He wrote once in The Abolition of Man, which is a book that I highly recommend, "I have described as a magician's bargain that process whereby man surrenders object after object and finally himself to nature in return for power." And I think we need to think about that too in our new world of AI and the powerful tools it provides. So as Christians, I think our calling is to have discussions among ourselves in the church and elsewhere. But I think we need to go beyond that. We need to kind of join the public square and kind of, take our Christian worldview and how it informs what we see as what it means to be human, but then start a dialogue with others, encouraging respectful dialogue among those of differing beliefs in order to partnership and to forge partnerships in service of the common good, to be talking to others in the larger public square about guardrails that we think we all should put in place so that we can all flourish. And here's some examples of organizations that Christian computer scientists and others could join to have an influence. AI for Good, Data Ethics for All. You've got a data science program here at Gordon, and I think data science is one of these other disciplines that really needs Christians. I mean, one of the pitfalls, one of the worldviews in data science is dataism, which sort of, to quote one author, dataism is the idea that there's no difference between a person or a giraffe or a tomato. They're just different ways of processing data. And at the end of the day, everything's data. And I think that's a very reductionistic way of looking at creation. And so Christians need to join these dialogues in order to promote responsible use of technology. I'm actually an advisor for an organization called AI and Faith, which is actually an interfaith dialogue. So there's Muslims, there's Jews, there's Baha'i, there's Christians, and we're talking together about, okay, what are some things that we can agree on? What are ways that we can build bridges, forge partnerships in order to seek the common good? And I like this quote from Brad Smith, who's president of Microsoft. In one of his recent books, he wrote, ultimately, a global conversation about ethical principles for AI will require an even bigger tent, he writes. There will need to be seats at the table not only for technologists, governments, NGOs, and educators, but for philosophers and representatives of the many world's religions, which hopefully has a seat for Christians as well. So finally, I'll end with this slide, and then we can open up a dialogue. I think at the end of the day, and this is something I've been thinking about more in my own life. The way that we're going to affect change and the way that we can think about, responsible ways forward is not just by having a bunch of ideas and frameworks in our head, but it's also looking at the heart. Proverbs 4, verse 23 says that above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Those opening words, above all else, means it's of strategic importance. And then we need to guard our heart. Why? Because everything you do flows from it. And that includes our technologies. That includes AI. It flows from the heart, not necessarily from philosophical frameworks. Frederick Brooks was a Christian computer scientist. Most CS people will have heard of him, maybe even met him. He was awarded the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in computer science. And he once wrote, if we would have our creations be true, beautiful, and good, we have to attend to our hearts. And so I commend that to you. And the way that you attend to your hearts is in part by retrieving ancient spiritual disciplines like Sabbath and studying scripture and solitude and serving others. These things shape us into the kinds of persons who can then engage this kind of world with being equipped for battle. So I'll park it here, and then if time allows, then I think we could open it up for questions, but thank you very much for listening to my little talk. Right.
Thank you, Derek. There's a lot for us to think and talk about. We do have time for questions, and I'll let you handle your own questions. Let me just say, we're looking for actual questions, not mini treatises. So keep your questions brief, and we're especially welcome questions from students. So feel free.
Yeah. Oh, we have a roving Donahue here, so yeah.
As you showed before in some of your article examples, that AI is being used in a creative process to either discover antibiotics or make creative things. Do you think AI should be entitled to any intellectual property or copyright rights?
Sorry, the last part, should it be used for intellectual?
Should it be entitled to intellectual property protections or copyright protections?
Yes. Okay, that's a really good question. And so there's so many aspects to AI. I just focused on two aspects, but you brought up another really big one. at the beginning you saw I mentioned how they go around hoovering up all of this data that becomes the basis for them to train their model to be unsurprised. And a lot of that data belongs to other people. And the New York Times, for instance, is wrangling with OpenAI about them hoovering up their data. I think artists, of which a lot of generative AI is based on statistical patterns that have been trained on other people's works, need to be compensated somehow for all of this. So that is another open question. I wonder, this is just speculative, but you know how in the many churches they have the CCLI, the sort of licensing thing when you sing a song, I imagine there's a couple pennies dropping into someone's wallet somewhere. But maybe the same kind of thing has to happen with intellectual property that's used as the basis of training large language models and other generative AI models in order to make sure that the people who've made the fodder that has now become what gives these engines their power can get properly compensated. So yeah, copyright and so on, I think is a big issue that needs to be in another place where regulation is going to be needed, so that there's justice, so that the norm of justice, people get their due. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, so as ontology and like what a human is being
Yeah.
kind of forced into the limelight, um, through your research, what have you seen like the average American or the average, I don't know, journalist, what has been their view on humanity? Just it's curiosity on my part.
On using chatbots as if they're persons, let's say, or
On what constitutes a person,
what is
because
a person?
this forces that into the limelight.
Yeah.
I feel like, so what has been like the kind of reaction of like, oh, a chatbot is not a person because of X, or has there been more a functionalist like
Yeah.
reaction?
That's a really interesting question. I think a social scientist would probably be better suited to kind of go and do a survey. But I think it does bring up these sort of enduring questions about what it means to be human. And if you're starting from the premise um, of physicalism, which is basically that we are nothing but machines ourselves, right? If all I am is sort of the interaction of electrochemical stuff going on in my brain, then I'm kind of an electrochemical machine running on wetware. A digital machine is running on different hardware. Then maybe it doesn't seem so bad to be marrying an AI girlfriend or an AI robot. If it's a machine and you see yourself as a machine, philosophically, it doesn't seem as problematic. But if we understand as Christians that we're made distinct from humans, from machines, and we should be troubled by that. And I don't think it's just Christians. I think the other world religions have an idea of the Imago Dei. Some of the Abrahamic religions, of course. If you read Sherry Turkle, as I mentioned, Alone Together, her more recent book, Reclaiming Conversation, which I think the CS folks here are reading, she actually was raised in a Jewish home. And if you read her work, you can see sort of the undercurrents of a Jewish understanding about what it means to be human informing all of her work, even though I think she's secular now. But I think those presuppositions are ones that we can we can join forces with other people who think that we're not machines in order to sort of seek the common good. But yeah, your presuppositions about what it means to be human will determine what you think about these sorts of things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's no questions on this side? Oh, okay, there's one. All right. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, so this might be a more personal question, but I was willing to ask, up to what degree are you willing to give up your personal and like your private data for the commodity of using these technologies?
So how much am I willing to give up?
Yeah, like I wanted to hear your perspective.
Yeah. I think there's certain parts of my life that would be helpful to share. Like some of the things that I've written as an academic. It's nice to get that in places where people can come across it. Um, as Christians, having our voice in the public square that people can encounter it, and maybe that being inside of a large language model. So there's some Christian thought that's sort of informing these things. But yeah, my personal life, I think that there's certain things that I don't like to share, and so I'm very careful about some of the things that I do with my data and the kinds of platforms and apps that I put on my phone, because those two are also generating data that's informing um, artificial intelligence neural networks that are used then to target you with personalized ads and other things that can actually be used to yeah, manipulate you. So and then I think it also goes back to the sort of matter of the heart and sort of ensuring that with your life that you're not just being always informed and shaped by a screen. Like our hearts, I think the way our hearts are shaped is through habits and practices. One of my colleagues at Calvin, Jamie Smith, a philosopher, has written about this. You Are What You Love is one of his books. And I think these habits and practices are things that we need to recapture so that we can be shaped, so that we have countermeasures against all of these manipulations that are going to be constantly. And I think as people living in this age, I think we have the impression that we're more resilient against those things than we really are. You know, and if you actually read about the Israelites in the Old Testament, they're always being sucked into the practices of the surrounding nations. And that's without social networking and web and media. And all. I mean, they're just living around these people. And I think we're even more powerfully manipulated than we even care to imagine. And the way around that, the sort of countermeasures, I think, is rediscovering ancient spiritual practices, um, which I'm still working on in my own life. But I would I would commend to you to ready as you're young to begin to practice these and learn about them. It'll make you into a certain kind of person, um, and that's the question we have to ask. You know, what does God want me to be? What does it mean to become more like Jesus? And then to be salt and light in the context that you live. So, yeah. And there's one there. I was going to ask if anyone has an AI girlfriend, but I don't want to put you on the spot. I'd like to know what that's like. No, go ahead. Sorry.
My question is just more out of lack of knowledge I have with AI, but when you put up like California is regulating what AI can do
Some
or what
things.
information it has, like
Yeah.
how do you go about regulating AI, and is that like how companies compute that, or how do you regulate that?
Yeah, that's a complex question, but there's political scientists in our midst. And I think this is part of our calling, right, is to be active in the public square, to seek legislation that can be used for the public good. And in AI, maybe like the way the EU works, I think it's fairly sensible legislation. It says that there are some things that we're going to agree are too dangerous and that we will outlaw AI doing. So things like a social credit system where they track every citizen and manipulate them and so on. We're not going to, they ban that. And then they sort of identify high risk applications, you know, things like autonomous cars and stuff that can kill people, right? That you want to regulate. You don't want to just have anyone, you know, writing code in their basement and then loading up a car and going for a drive. Like you want to have some kind of regulations. And then sort of like lower risk applications have, you know, you run them in a sandbox, you test them, but there's some regulations. There's some sort of a national testing facility that sort of checks for certain things. And then certain applications, categories which are like super low risk or no risk that people can do without being encumbered by regulation. I think some kind of spectrum like that, where you identify higher risk and lower risk, and you have different requirements. I think that's a sensible approach. But yeah, these things are still evolving and require different kinds of skills than a computer scientist has, quite frankly. And so I always say that I hope it's not the computer scientists that are making the decisions about how we're going to be living our lives with these new technologies. And I'm speaking as a computer scientist. I think, like Brad Smith said in that final quote, we need theologians and philosophers and political scientists and thoughtful lay people to kind of join the conversation. Like, what are the lines we should sort of draw around these sorts of things, and how do we want to use it? I mean, and of course, we do want to use it. There are so many good ways to use it, like drug discovery and Bible translation. I mean, I listed some of these easy ones, but there's not only things that we can do. There's probably things we should do with AI. But these other things, I think companies that are driven by, you know, sort of the desire to kind of be the first with sort of this cutting edge stuff are going to be working unbridled if there isn't some kind of guardrails that are put up. And so I think, and then participating in the public square and, and talking to your congressperson and taking some political science to know how the system works and maybe if you have if you're a computer scientist, joining some of these ethical groups like AI for Good and so on, where you can work with a larger and AI and faith work in a larger context. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or
So as we're thinking about how we define personhood and
yeah,
also looking at besides the more technological abilities of AI, also the creative aspects like writing a Dr. Seuss poem about Gordon College or AI generated art or music, how do we use the fact that I feel like often in creative circles we use creativity as a part of what the image of God actually means? And so how do we reconcile that with AI and generative AI especially?
yeah, yeah. Is generative AI really creative? And what does it mean to be made in the image of God? You know, we used to say it was our intellect and our rational capacity, and then Deep Blue beat the reigning chess champion in 1997, and that caused a lot of crisis. Like, oh no, machines could beat us, in terms of our rational thought. And I think the image of God is a many splendored thing. It's not just creativity. It's not just our rational capacity. It's also our relationship that we can have with God and with each other. I mean, it's multidimensional. And if there's a theologian here, I would defer to him or her. But so it's not just our creativity. But I think, if the stuff that's coming out of generative AI, and this is where I'm going out on a bit of a limb here, I'd say a lot of it is derivative, right? It's basically a bunch of human created input, and then a bunch of calculators do a whole bunch of number manipulations, and then another image pops out. I mean, the people who make the algorithms that actually can do all of this stuff is very creative. But I think what pops out is different than the kind of inspiration that humans would have. And in fact, what they're finding is that more and more AI generated stuff as it goes out on the web, and if AI uses the AI generated stuff in order to do further training, that there ends up becoming this reduction it poisons the data set actually by having AI training on AI generated output. So my instinct is that it can be beautiful and surprising and delightful, the output of some of this generative stuff, but it is derivative really. It's taking thousands of millions of exemplars and then performing some statistical tricks in order to produce something that has echoes of all of those things in it. But yeah. I think we have one over here. Yeah. Does Gordon have an AI policy for students can just generate all their essays with ChatGPT and no?
We had discussions about whether there should be, and there was a task force.
Okay, a task
There's
force.
no one.
Okay, okay.
You're
Sorry.
good with task force.
Okay. I don't have answers, by the way, but yeah, go ahead.
In AI's as AI's ability is to mimic human activity is increased, what aspects of a human's function do you think AI will find it most difficult to mimic, and what functions do you think AI would find it easiest to mimic?
That's a really interesting question. What functions would they find it hardest to mimic? And that's a very good question. I have to chew on that for a while. But I think they're going to get to the point where it will fool most of the people most of the time. But yeah, I think once you're, if someone were to ever get into a relationship with an AI, you would quickly find that, there's no one home. And you probably wouldn't, you might not notice it in the interactions, but in the way that it forms you over time. But I have to think about it. That's a really good question. I think AI can do a lot of stuff with inductive logic really well if it's got a good data set, classifying something, if it's got enough inferential data to kind of be able to predict, classify something. But um, but yeah. Offer forgiveness. Yeah, interesting. Could it pray for you? Could it, yeah, have a relationship? We've talked a bit about this. Could an AI have a relationship with God? I Original research. Yeah, yeah, original, because everything's derivative. So maybe having fresh ideas that aren't in the data set. That when humans have a eureka moment, I don't know what happens when that happens, but those kinds of things. They can only come up with something that's derivative of their data set because basically it's just data and a bunch of calculators and output, if you can kind of model it that way in your head. But I'm going to be thinking about that question for a while. So thank you for posing it. That's a good, it also gets at the question, what does it mean to be human? That's underneath all of that. What is it hardest for a machine to do? So it's another way of rephrasing that and coming up with concrete examples. So thank you for that. Yeah,
Sort of returning to a couple questions ago
yeah.
regarding the area of sort of a regulation. Personally, are you hopeful that our ability to realize what we're doing will catch up with how fast this technology is advancing, or
Yeah.
what do you think about that?
I'm worried about that because I think it is advancing so quickly. I mean, even computer scientists, I think, were taken off guard about how well these things were performing. Um, for example, another example, like back in the early 2000s, I was in grad school doing computer vision research using machine learning. And if you asked anyone in our lab, will these machines ever be able to like autonomously drive a car? We would have laughed at you because the trouble of doing computer vision in unstructured environments and unstructured lighting, all our experiments were done on optical workbenches with controlled lighting and all that kind of stuff. But within 10 years, there was a proof of concept autonomous car. So I think things are also surprising to computer scientists as well. And so I think right now it seems like not an arms race, but a race, right, to see who can build the best language model, who can build the best system. And it seems to be unbridled right now. And I think that the conversation about the ethics side of it is happening at a much slower pace. And so I'm concerned about that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of being human is also that we're finite. So we even with all of these norms we need to consider, we don't always know what the implications are going to be to us and to the larger society. And so I think with new technologies, it's always good to have sort of experimenters trying things out in a sandbox before we unleash these things into the wild so that we can get some feedback on how well they work. And so I think right now there's no incentive for people to hold back. And that worries me, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, over here. Yeah.
Do you personally consider like the way that AI kind of like borrows resources that are already out in the digital world? Like, do
Yeah.
you see that as plagiarism? Like, do people, computer scientists, journalists, like, is that something that's highly believed? Because I've heard that opinion a lot.
Yeah, I think so, right? If you're using other people's data without their permission, especially copyrighted stuff, some of these companies are screen scraping data, whatever they can get. I think that's that's a justice issue, not giving people things that they're due. And so that's something I think that's going to have to be worked out. And people are already talking about this. I think New York Times sued OpenAI, if I'm not mistaken. And so there's people hashing all of that stuff out as we speak. But yeah, I think, and if you're a content creator or you're an artist, or if you're in any kind of the creative arts, you want to make sure that your work is safeguarded and that you are compensated for the good stuff that you do. I don't want to live in a world where everything's generated by AI. I always think I love the movie Wall-E because it's this wonderful parable I don't want to be living like the humans there, right? Or in these lazy boy chairs sipping Slurpees and the machines are doing everything. That, that's not what we're called to be. That's being a shadow of what it means to be fully human. What's nice about that movie, it ends with hope, right? They can barely walk, but they waddle back onto the earth holding this little fledgling plant, and there's kind of hope that they'll be able to do what they're supposed to do again. And so, yeah.
Maybe time for one more question.
It's up to you.
Two more questions.
Okay.
Should we look for beauty in AI? Like, is AI capable of producing beauty?
That's another interesting question. Beauty. Yeah, I know that personally, some of the things that I've seen come out of AI are beautiful. I think it's different than originality or creativity. So something that's derivative can also be beautiful. I kind of like the Dr. Seuss poem that the thing made too. It was amusing. But yeah, some of the AI generated stuff, I mean, if beauty is aesthetically pleasing, if that's how you're going to define it, and not necessarily novel, right, or original, but beautiful in the terms of just aesthetically pleasing, I think it can create kind of beauty. And I can see beauty in other things too, like data and algorithms that are inside of a computer can be beautiful too, actually. Um, you can see aesthetics in all kinds of different aspects, even with machines. I think even, some of the old vacuum tube amplifiers and some of the old, camshafts and pulleys, these old steam engines, they have a kind of beauty as well. So I think machines can be beautiful in how they work and the outputs that they produce. I think that's one of the delights that engineers have. Um, so yes, I think it can be beautiful. Yeah.
That last question. Where was it?
I think it was over here. Yeah.
I think you've done a wonderful job. I feel like you've pointed out some really interesting ways of sort of challenging our understanding of spaces where AI might sort of increase injustice. I'd be really curious to hear earlier, like a month or so ago, we actually had an opportunity to sort of reflect as a community what it means to be bridge builders of justice. And so I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts on maybe how AI, the effects or possibilities for sort of maybe in gaps where like people groups like on the margins or who are
Yeah.
under resourced, what does that look like, especially where we have a large accessibility of knowledge but maybe not wisdom. So like as sort of that changes, like you said, it used to be what like the imago Dei was in our understanding of reason,
Yes.
and now that is changing. So I'd be interested, like, and you use the example of sort of the companions for elders, but like what do you sort of see? I guess what I'm asking is, with the creation of AI, what are the possibilities to love other humans well?
Yeah. So, and justice, right, is your question. Here's one slide that I have in another talk that I do, but these are just some examples of injustice. This is a classic book that data scientists should all read. It's a little more dated now, but it's by Kathy O'Neill, who was like one of the pioneering people in the field of data science. She worked as a quant, like doing financial stuff, using her mathematical knowledge to make lots of money for banks. And when the huge crash happened in 2007, she sat back and thought, "Wow, I think I had something to do with that, and I have a responsibility." And the book subtitles how it's weapons of math destruction, and the subtitles how big data increases inequality and threatens democracy, which is an alarming subtitle. But she goes in there and shows examples of how if we start using AI to determine who gets a loan, who gets parole? And in fact, if you look at the other title there, machine bias, there's software used across the country to predict future criminals, and it's biased against blacks. That the bias that's implicit in the data that we're using to train these things can be amplified and be perpetuated through these kinds of models. And it isn't just the data, the algorithms too. I mean, at the end of the day, AI is simply solving a mathematical minimization or maximization problem. And so the question of, should we have machines making ethical decisions? I think you could translate to say, is there a mathematical expression for justice? And maybe there isn't. Maybe there's ways we can capture pieces of it. But there's some other examples here too, right? Amazon Scraps, their AI recruiting tool that showed bias against women. AI in healthcare can lead to discrimination. So there's example after example, especially when it's used about when AI is being used to who gets a job, who gets a loan, who gets a raise, who gets, all of these sorts of things. This justice issue becomes huge, especially when these are deployed like nationwide. So that's an excellent book for data scientists, Weapons of Math Destruction. And there are real justice issues in the construction of these and how they're deployed. This is a big issue in data. And I'm sure your data scientists here at Gordon are talking about these kinds of things. That's something I think that's really distinctive about a Christian college teaching data science, right? It's sort of avoiding the pitfall of dataism. The problem with data science is that when all you're doing is data, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You sort of have this idea that the whole world is just, and you can capture truth in data. You can capture an aspect of truth, but not everything that counts can be counted. And so we need to think about that when we're building these kinds of tools. So that's an example of justice and AI and the norm of justice that I talked about earlier. So,
Well, thank you.
yeah, thank you for really interesting questions. Yeah.